The sun burned her pride before it burned her skin. Evelyn Hart hung from the wooden cross at the edge of Dry Creek, her wrists bound tight, her lips cracked by heat and dust. The noon light was merciless, each ray a blade cutting through what was left of her strength. Around her, the townsfolk gathered in silence, hats tilted low, faces hidden in shadow. Some muttered prayers, others just watched. None stepped forward. The air smelled of sand and sweat, and something worse, shame. The preacher stood a few yards away, Bible raised high. His voice rolled like thunder across the square. Sin must be burned out before the soul can be free. The crowd nodded, eager to believe. It was easier that way, to see a sinner than to face the sin inside themselves. Evelyn's head drooped. Strands of her dark hair clung to her face. Her throat was too dry to cry out, but her heart was still loud, pounding against the ropes that held her. She wasn't afraid of dying, not anymore. She was afraid of being forgotten, of vanishing under the weight of lies told in God's name. A bead of sweat slid down her neck. A whisper of wind carried dust across her feet. For a second, the world went still. The preacher's voice faded into the distance, and all she could hear was the soft creak of the cross, wood complaining under the weight of injustice. She looked toward the hills, eyes blurred by tears and sunlight. And there, beyond the ridge, a shadow moved. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't a ghost. It was a man on horseback, watching. He didn't shout, didn't draw his gun. He simply sat beneath the burning sky, eyes fixed on the cross and the woman bound to it. And in that moment, before anyone else noticed, mercy took its first breath. But she wasn't alone. Someone was watching from the ridge. His name was Samuel Briggs, once a soldier, now just a man trying to outlive his ghosts. The war had ended years ago, but he still carried it inside him. In the limp of his left leg, in the way he reached for a gun that wasn't there, and in the silence he chose every morning instead of prayer. He'd built his cabin high above Dry Creek, far enough to forget the screams, close enough to remember what mercy used to mean. Most days he kept to himself, fixing fences, feeding the horses, and letting the world below burn without him. But that day, the sun caught something strange on the horizon. From his porch, he saw the crowd first, a gathering of bodies like a dark wound in the pale dust, and at its heart a wooden cross rising from the earth. The glint of light off iron shackles made his chest tighten. He thought it was another hanging. The West had plenty of those. But then the wind carried a sound to him, not a man's cry, but a woman's breath, hoarse and breaking. It froze him. He hadn't heard that sound since the night he lost Clara, the woman he'd loved and failed to save. The night the church burned, and his faith went with it. Samuel clenched his jaw, eyes locked on the hill. The preacher's voice echoed faintly up the slope, a chant, not a sermon. Let the sun burn the sin away. He spat into the dirt. That ain't the Lord talkin', he muttered. That's pride. The horse beneath him stirred, sensing the weight in his chest. He hadn't meant to ride down there. He'd promised himself never again, never to get between a mob and its madness, never to carry another soul's suffering. But mercy doesn't ask permission. It just pulls at what's left of your humanity and whispers, "Go." He saddled up slow, hands trembling, not from fear, but from remembering what it costs to care. Each hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat as he rode toward the heat and the noise. Dust rose behind him, curling in the light like smoke from an old war. When he reached the edge of town, he saw her clearly for the first time. A girl bound to the cross, skin scorched, dignity stripped away, yet eyes still fierce. And in that moment, something inside him broke, the wall he'd built between himself and the world. He pulled his horse to a stop, the crowd parting just enough for him to see the preacher's face, glowing with a false light. Samuel's hand hovered near his holster, but he didn't draw. Not yet. He took a deep breath, feeling the sun press against his back like judgment itself. He had sworn never to fight again. But mercy, he realized, has its own kind of call. And as he stepped off his horse, dust swirling around his boots, one thought anchored itself in his heart. He had no idea that saving her would cost him everything. The crowd stood frozen when the stranger walked into the square. Samuel Briggs, dust still clinging to his coat, eyes sharp beneath the shadow of his hat, looked like a man carved from the desert itself. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood there, watching the woman suffer beneath a sun that seemed determined to erase her. Preacher Hale noticed him. His voice boomed louder, as if to drown out the stranger's silence. "This woman carries the devil's mark," he cried, Bible raised high. "And today the light of heaven shall cleanse her flesh." The people echoed him. "Burn the sin, save the soul." Samuel's jaw tightened. His eyes swept the faces of men and women he once traded grain with, laughed with, buried kin beside. They wouldn't meet his gaze now. Their eyes clung to Hale like a child to its father's lie. He stepped forward through the dust, stopping just a few feet from the preacher. His voice, when it came, was quiet, too calm for a man about to start a war. "Tell me something, Reverend," he said. "Is this your faith or your fear?" The crowd murmured. Hale's face twitched, but he masked it with a smile too wide to be holy. "My faith needs no lesson from a man who hides in the hills," the preacher spat. "This girl resisted the will of God." Samuel's gaze flicked to Evelyn. Her eyes met his, weary but alive. "She fought you," he said, "not God." A gasp rippled through the square. Hale turned red, slamming his hand against the wooden cross. "Silence this man! He dares to mock the Lord!" Two farmhands, young, frightened, stepped forward at his command. They hesitated, glancing between the preacher's fury and the calm fire in Samuel's eyes. He didn't reach for his gun. Instead, he took off his hat, letting the wind carry the dust from its brim. "I've seen real devils," he said quietly. "They don't hide in shadows or wear horns. They hide behind pulpits and talk about salvation while their hands still smell of smoke." The preacher froze. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Even the sun seemed to pause. Evelyn whispered, voice trembling, "He tried to shame me. I fought back, and now he calls me a witch." A murmur spread like wildfire. Some looked away. Some frowned. A mother pulled her child closer. Doubt had entered the circle. Small, fragile, but alive. Hale's eyes darted to his sleeve, where faint red scratches marked his skin. He tugged the fabric lower, but Samuel had already seen. "That mark on your arm," Samuel said evenly, "that the devil's work too?" The preacher's voice broke into a snarl. "You're poisoning these people with your lies." He turned to the crowd. "Do not listen. The devil speaks through this man." Samuel didn't flinch. "If truth sounds like the devil to you," he said softly, "maybe you ought to ask what you've been worshiping." The mob began to waver. Voices rose, whispers turning to argument. Hale tried to shout them down, his words desperate now. "She will break! She will beg! Then her sin will be gone!" Samuel stepped closer to the cross. The ropes cut into Evelyn's wrists. Her breath came in sharp, shallow gasps. Without a word, he took his knife from his belt and sliced through the first knot. The crowd recoiled as if struck. Hale screamed, "Stop him! He defies God himself!" But no one moved, not yet. The blade found the second knot. The rope snapped. Evelyn crumpled forward into Samuel's arms, too weak to stand. He wrapped his coat around her shoulders, shielding her from the sun. A tremor of fear ran through the people, not of the preacher anymore, but of the truth unraveling before them. Hale raised his Bible once more, shaking with rage. "This man brings ruin upon your souls!" Samuel met his eyes, voice steady as stone. "If justice burns a woman alive, then I'll gladly stand in its way." And as he lifted Evelyn onto his horse, the preacher's shouts faded into the wind. He thought he'd saved her, but this was only the beginning of a darker fight. Night fell over Dry Creek like judgment. The wind carried the smell of smoke before the people even saw it. The chapel, the preacher's holy fortress, was burning. Flames licked through the dry boards, painting the town in orange and ash. Some said it was the Lord's wrath. Others whispered that it was guilt made visible. But Hale's voice cut through the chaos, shrill and furious. "Do not fear the fire," he shouted, face glowing in the inferno's light. "It is God's cleansing hand. He burns so that we may be pure." Men and women wept, torn between terror and belief. Children clung to their mothers' skirts. And in the middle of it all, Samuel Briggs stood with Evelyn Hart, holding her steady as the cross behind them cracked and collapsed into sparks. "Stay close," he said, his voice rough from smoke. She stumbled, coughing. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." He didn't answer at first. He just guided her through the alley, eyes scanning the rooftops where shadows moved. "I know what it feels like," he muttered finally, "to be condemned by someone claiming to speak for God." The preacher's men, loyal to fear more than faith, began to search the streets. "Find them," Hale's order echoed between the buildings. "Find the witch and her protector." They slipped through the back of the town, the glow of the fire chasing their heels. Evelyn's bare feet cut on the stones, but she didn't complain. Every time she stumbled, Samuel caught her by the arm, lifting her as if she weighed nothing. At the edge of the ravine, their horses waited, frightened, restless. Samuel helped her mount, then swung into his saddle, grimacing as his old war wound tore open again. Blood darkened his pant leg, but he bit down the pain. "Hold on," he said. "We ride north." Behind them, the chapel's bell collapsed with a final cry, a sound that was neither holy nor human. They rode into the dark, chased by the roar of the fire and the preacher's hatred. After miles of silence, Evelyn finally spoke, her voice quiet, broken, but alive. "I prayed for help," she whispered. "I didn't expect a man with a gun." Samuel almost smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "the Lord sends whoever still has a conscience." They reached the ridge by dawn's first light. The land stretched wide and quiet, a sea of ash and sagebrush beneath a pale sky. But rest never comes easy to the hunted. A shot rang out, sharp, clean, echoing through the valley. The bullet struck Samuel's shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. He gritted his teeth, stayed upright. Another shot followed. The preacher's riders had found them. "Ride!" he barked. Evelyn hesitated, reaching for him, but he shouted again, "Go!" She kicked her horse forward, heart pounding. The sound of hooves behind her blended with gunfire and dust. Samuel turned his mount sideways on the narrow pass, blocking the trail. When the first pursuer appeared, he fired once, a warning shot that shattered the man's hat clean off his head. "Turn back!" he yelled. "This ends tonight!" But Hale's men didn't stop. They never did. Faith, twisted by fear, turns into something uglier than hate. A second bullet tore through Samuel's arm. His revolver dropped to the dirt. The horse screamed beneath him, rearing high. He clung to the reins, eyes wild, but he didn't fall. He raised his voice, hoarse but defiant. "You can burn your church, Hale, but you can't burn the truth." Another shot answered him, missing but close. He spurred his horse, fleeing into the canyon. By the time he reached Evelyn again, he was bleeding badly. She slid off her horse to catch him as he fell, dragging him toward the mouth of a small cave carved into the cliffside. Inside, the air was cool and dark. The fire's glow flickered faintly against the walls, like a distant memory of hell. Evelyn tore a strip from her torn dress and pressed it against his wound. "You're losing too much blood," she whispered. Samuel winced, but managed a faint grin. "I've lost worse." "Why didn't you just leave me?" He looked at her, really looked. Not as a victim, not as a burden, but as someone who'd been forced to carry another man's sin. "Because if I did," he said softly, "I'd be no better than the ones who let my wife burn." Her breath caught. She didn't ask what he meant. The silence between them said enough. Outside, the sky flickered red, the fire spreading through the town like a confession too long withheld. Inside the cave, the only light came from the faint reflection of those flames dancing in their eyes. One side judgment, the other grace. And for the first time that night, Evelyn prayed not for salvation, but for the strength to believe that mercy still existed in this forsaken land. Dawn crept over Dry Creek like an old man's sigh. The fire had died some time before morning, leaving only smoke rising from what once was a church. The bell lay shattered in the street, half buried in ash. And in the middle of it all, Preacher Hale knelt in the dust, wrists bound, face smeared with soot. The sheriff had found him wandering near the riverbank, screaming about demons and betrayal. Now he stood guard, shotgun resting on his shoulder, while the town gathered in uneasy silence. Samuel Briggs leaned against a fence post, his arm bound tight from the bullet wound. His face was pale, but his eyes were steady. Beside him, Evelyn Hart stood wrapped in his coat, the morning light tracing the bruises on her wrists. The sheriff broke the silence first. "I want the truth," he said, "all of it." No one answered. The people of Dry Creek, those who had cheered yesterday, now stared at the ground. Their faith hung like smoke, heavy and uncertain. Finally, Evelyn stepped forward. Her voice was soft, but carried farther than any sermon. "He called me cursed," she said, "but the only curse I carried was his hands on me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sheriff's eyes hardened. He turned to Hale. "You used the name of God to hide your shame." Hale laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You fools," he rasped. "Without faith you are nothing. Without me, this town is nothing." Samuel took one step closer, his boots crunching over the charred earth. "Faith ain't meant to be a leash," he said, "and God don't need your permission to forgive." Hale spat at his feet. "You think you're righteous, soldier? You've killed men. You've sinned like the rest of us." Samuel nodded slowly. "I have. And that's how I know redemption ain't found in fire." The crowd murmured again. The sheriff raised his hand for silence. "This man will stand trial," he declared. "No mob, no cross, no preacher's word will decide guilt again. The law will." For a long moment, no one moved. Then someone in the back, an old seamstress, spoke. "Let it be done proper," she said. "We've burned enough souls in this town." The mob began to dissolve, shame washing through them like cold rain. Some wept. Others simply walked away, heads bowed. Evelyn watched them go. Her body trembled, not from fear this time, but from the weight of choice. She turned to Samuel. "They'd have let him burn me," she whispered, "and part of me wants him to feel what I felt." Samuel's eyes softened. "Then you'd still be tied to that cross," he said quietly. "Sometimes mercy is the hardest bullet to fire." For a moment she stared at him, at the man who had bled for her without asking anything in return. Then, slowly, she reached up to her neck and untied the torn strip of cloth that had hidden her bruises. The wind caught it, lifting it from her hand, carrying it toward the morning sky. "No more crosses today," she said. The sheriff nodded, tipping his hat. "That'll do." He motioned to 2 deputies, who led Hale away through the ruins. The preacher didn't shout this time. He just stared at the ground, muttering to ghosts that no one else could hear. Samuel exhaled, the tension draining from his shoulders. "Looks like the town finally remembered what justice feels like," he murmured. Evelyn looked toward the rising sun. "Justice," she said softly, "or grace?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes they're the same thing." A hush settled over the valley. The fire was gone. The screams had faded. And in their place, something fragile had taken root. Not peace, not yet, but the promise of it. As the first true light of day spread across the ashes, Samuel adjusted his hat, his voice low, almost to himself. "Maybe the Lord ain't done with us after all." And somewhere in the distance, a lark began to sing, thin, trembling, but alive. The morning after the fire was quiet. Too quiet for a town that had just survived its own damnation. Ash clung to every rooftop, every fence post, even the church bell that now lay cracked in the street. But above it all, the sky stretched wide and clear, pale gold after the storm. Samuel Briggs stood by what was left of the chapel door, his arms still bandaged, his shirt streaked with soot. The wound throbbed with every breath, but he didn't mind. Pain had its place. It reminded him he was still here. Evelyn Hart knelt nearby, hammering the last nail into a wooden plank. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Each strike echoed softly through the valley. When she was done, she brushed the dust from the board. The letters carved into it read, "Morning Chapel." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "You sure about the name?" Samuel gave a faint smile. "Seems right. World's seen enough fire. Time it saw a little light." They lifted the sign together, planting it into the earth where the church had once stood. The scent of burned timber still lingered, but the air held something gentler now, the smell of hope trying to be born again. When the work was done, Evelyn disappeared into what was left of the parsonage and returned with 2 tin cups and a kettle of weak tea. She poured slowly, her hands trembling only slightly. Samuel accepted his cup with a nod. Steam curled into the cool morning air, catching the sunlight like smoke made of gold. They drank in silence for a long while. No words, no sermons, just the sound of wind and the creak of a half-broken porch. Evelyn finally spoke. "You ever think God gets tired of watching us repeat the same sins?" Samuel stared into his cup, then looked toward the horizon. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe he just waits to see if we'll learn something this time." She smiled faintly, eyes glistening. "You think there's still something left worth learning?" He glanced at her, and for a heartbeat neither of them looked away. "Yeah," he said softly, "like how to start over." A gust of wind moved through the yard, stirring the ashes at their feet. Evelyn watched them dance before settling into the dirt. "It's strange," she said. "Yesterday I wanted to see everything burn. Now I just want things to grow again." Samuel nodded, eyes warm. "That's how the desert heals. First comes the fire, then the bloom." She set her cup down, folding her hands in her lap. "And you? You'll stay?" He looked out toward the far ridge where his cabin stood, a dark speck against the golden plain. "I reckon I will," he said, "at least till you don't need someone to carry lumber." She laughed softly, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. It was small, shy, but honest. For a while they just sat there, the sun climbing higher, brushing warmth across their faces. The whole world seemed to breathe again. A pair of doves landed on the chapel beam above them. Evelyn tilted her head, smiling. "Look at that! Guess even they think it's safe again." Samuel's eyes followed them, his voice a low murmur. "For the first time in years, I feel the sun without guilt." The light settled gently across his shoulders, not the harsh fire of judgment, but something forgiving. Evelyn reached out, touching his arm, not to thank him, not to claim him, just to let him know she understood. Neither spoke after that. The wind carried the faint melody of a hymn someone hummed down the street. Children's laughter followed, thin and uncertain, but real. Evelyn picked up her hammer again, turning it in her hand. "You think people will come back? Pray here again?" Samuel looked at the rebuilt sign, its fresh wood glowing in the sunlight. "If they do," he said, "I hope they pray for mercy first." She nodded. "And forgiveness after?" He smiled. "No, forgiveness always comes first." The breeze grew warmer. The air shimmered like a blessing. Somewhere, far away, a church bell rang. Not theirs, not yet, but enough to remind them that faith, like morning, always returns. And as the sun rose over the ashes of Dry Creek, two souls sat quietly beneath its light, not as savior and saved, but simply as two people learning how to live again. The sun had already climbed high over Dry Creek when Samuel Briggs finally rose from the porch. The morning air was soft, the kind that carries silence instead of sound. Evelyn stood by the chapel door, tracing her fingers over the wooden sign they'd raised together, Morning Chapel. Behind them, the town stirred awake. A hammer striking wood, a wagon creaking down the road, a woman humming an old hymn as she swept her porch. Life had returned, fragile, imperfect, but real. Samuel adjusted his hat, eyes drifting to the horizon. The ashes had cooled, but he knew the fire inside people would take longer. He'd seen too many towns destroy themselves, too many men use God's name like a weapon. But this time, he'd seen something else too. The moment when a single act of courage could change the course of everything. Maybe that was what faith really was, not blind obedience, not fear dressed as holiness, but the quiet strength to stand when standing costs you everything. His voice came low, almost a whisper to himself. Maybe salvation doesn't come from miracles, but from the quiet courage to stand against wrong. Evelyn turned, smiling faintly. "Then maybe, Samuel, you found yours." He shook his head, the corners of his mouth softening. "No, we found it." A pause. Then the breeze carried the faint sound of children laughing again, a sound that always means hope has decided to stay. And so, before the story fades into the dust of the prairie, I want to leave you with this. If you were Samuel Briggs, standing there, facing the preacher, the crowd, the fire, would you have pulled the trigger, or let mercy speak instead? It's a hard question, maybe the hardest. Because sometimes, in this wild and broken world, mercy takes more courage than revenge ever will. Leave your thoughts on this Western tale in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please take a second to like the video and subscribe for more true Wild West stories, tales of courage, second chances, and quiet redemption. Pour yourself a cup of tea or maybe a late-night coffee. Take a breath and tell me, what time is it where you're listening from tonight?